So I just wanted to say a quick welcome. We're just waiting for everyone to get into the room here. Appreciate everyone signing on. It's to talk about voting as our superpower. All lines are going to be muted unless people are speaking. And while we're all here, if we could drop in your name, pronouns, Indigenous lands that you're calling in from into the chat box, that would be great. And if you have any questions or comments that you would like to just say, or questions for our speakers, please feel free to drop them into the chat box as well. We'll be monitoring and making sure that your questions get answered. Couple other things, we want to make sure we're all respectful, no inappropriate behavior, otherwise it will be removed from the Zoom meeting. The presentation can best be viewed by selecting the speaker view option, which is in the top right corner. And we're going to be live streaming this and recording it, so it'll be live streamed on Facebook and recording for future use, just so everyone is in the know. And we're going to be joining here shortly, or starting shortly. All right, for those still come in, I see a few more people. Feel free to drop your name, pronouns, and Indigenous lands that you're on, so we can all have a chance to meet each other via the chat box. And just a little reference, I'm Kendra Kloster, the Executive Director of Native Peoples Action and Native Peoples Action Community Fund. Currently living on Dena'ina lands, and I'm super excited to be joined by lots of other co-hosts and people here and everyone calling in from across the state to talk about voting. Super important. So this is, we call this our voting is our superpower. So appreciate everyone being here. And are we, Ryan, am I getting the thumbs up that we're ready to get going here? All right, perfect. Well, I'm going to hand it over to Kelsey.
Waka Koyana Dailuji Unomuk Winga Jugutunga Mam Tresaramiunga Dauga Mani Dena'ina Esnenia Mi Witatunga Communications Director Agolosu Native Peoples Action Nami Jali Native Peoples Action Community Fund Amisu. Hi everyone, my name is Kelsey Jugun Wallace and I'm originally from Bethel or Mamtresak. I now live and work on the lands of the Dena'ina peoples, and I'm the communications director with Native Peoples Action and Native Peoples Action Community Fund. We just wanted to take this moment right now in kicking off this webinar to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral and unceded traditional territory of Alaska Native people throughout the state of Alaska. And if you do know whose traditional lands you are currently on and haven't dropped them in the comment box, feel free to do so. If you don't know whose traditional lands you are on, I really encourage you to take some time to learn in honor and appreciation of the first peoples of your lands. We are on unceded territory, which means that the indigenous people of this land never surrendered the lands or resources to Russia or the United States. And we're thankful to the communities who have stewarded and continue to care for these lands and waters and our animal relatives. It's important that we know the true history of our state and why right now, almost more than ever, it's important that we show up to the polls to protect our ways of life and our communities, to vote our values, and to ensure that we're doing our part for the future of Alaska that we know that we deserve. So right now, I'm gonna pass it on to Evan.
Thanks, Kelsey. I'm honored to be here today, calling in from Dena'ina lands as well. My name's Evan Anderson. I use they, them pronouns. I'm Civic Engagement Director with the Alaska Center Education Fund. And a fun fact today is that I actually share I didn't grow up on these lands. I'm a guest on these lands like many of us. And I grew up on Lenni Lenape territory back on the East Coast. And it's something I share with one of our speakers today. Something that we've been really enjoying in kind of our conversations, helping to plan this webinar today. But there's a ton of co-hosts here today represented on the call, including members of the Just Transition Coalition, in addition to Native Peoples Action and the Alaska Center Education Fund, Alaska Public Interest Research Group, Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, Native Movement, and the Alaska Black Caucus. And these webinars, this is the second in a series. And we are grateful to Joel Isaac for the language and translation and art and pronunciation to help guide these webinars. We're calling them Catalyzing Change, and the Dena'ina translation is We Are Working as One. Today in talking about voting, we're reflecting on the state of voting rights here in Alaska. And it's a really momentous occasion to do so, because 100 years ago, women, predominantly white women, gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. A decade later, Indigenous Alaskans and Indigenous Americans gained citizenship, and it took another 40 years after that for Black and Indigenous Americans across the board to gain universal voting rights through the Voting Rights Act and other pieces of legislation at that time as well. Here in Alaska, I'd say that our communities have certainly benefited from the Voting Rights Act in the last 50 years, and we have another anniversary to celebrate this month, and we'll have more details for some events that are coming up later this month. But the March on Washington has an anniversary this month as well, and we'll be able to share some community celebrations around that as well. But here in Alaska, if we could advance to the next slide, just like across the country, we've seen universal rolling back of voting rights across the country. And here in Alaska, less so. But across the country, we're seeing things like strict photo ID laws for voting. We see voter registration systems that are outdated and have high burdens to enter. We see vote at home systems or absentee systems that are highly restricted still in many states, or require excuses in many states, or you know, in a year like this year, where arguably we could all benefit from ballots being mailed to, or ballot applications at least being mailed to every voter, that's not happening in the vast majority of states. And so our electoral system remains inaccessible. Another thing that's occurred here in Alaska since the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013 was has been the closure of polling places, especially in rural Alaska. There have been, I believe, 8 polling places closed here in the last 8 years, predominantly in smaller communities where the schools have closed in recent years. The polling places closed shortly thereafter, therefore silencing the voices of those small communities unless those folks are all able to access the vote from home. So I don't want to keep talking all day. I just wanted to set a little bit of context for our speakers, and I think I'm going to hand it over to Kendra, or actually I think to Kelsey first to share how to view the panel, and then I think Kendra after that to share a little bit more about our speakers.
Awesome, thanks Evan. So we're gonna switch into a panel style viewing right now. So if folks could turn off your video, if you look at the bottom left of your Zoom panel, there's a button that says stop video. If you can click on that, all lines will be muted unless you're speaking to make sure that we give speakers space. And then if you are wanting to hide the non-video participants, just click the 3 dots next to your name at the top video bar, and there should be a button that says hide non-video participants. That way only the folks who have video will show up in like a panel style. We really encourage everybody to continue asking questions and engage in the conversation through the chat box. So whether you're on Zoom, or if you're watching on Facebook, if you have any kinds of questions or comments, be sure to drop them in the chat box. And all of the questions that are asked will be gathered and then given to the moderator so that they can address those at a later time. And I think we actually are going to hand it off to Kendra right now.
So about 92 years ago, my Tsimshian great-grandmother, Janet, was about 8 years old, and she was getting ready to attend school. Earlier that year, the legislature had passed a law that permitted Native students to attend the white schools if there was enough room for them. On the first day of school, my great-grandmother, her sister, and a friend went to class. None of them were acknowledged that day. The following morning, when they returned to their desks, they returned to school, their desks were stacked in the hallway. They then went home because there was no room for them. And this failure of the teachers and the school administration to adhere to desegregation of schools led to a court case where my great-grandmother and the others testified. They won that case, but due to some situational factors, only my great-grandmother chose to attend the all-white school. About 20 years after that, my grandmother Joyce was about 6 years old, and this was during World War II, and her grandmother, my great-grandmother Rose, had some family friends who were being sent off to internment camp. They asked Rose if she could take care of their store/cafe while they were away, and if she would consider returning it to them when they came back home. She said yes. So while she was caring for the business, she took her grandchildren, my grandmother, her sister, and cousins on a buying trip to Prince Rupert. My grandmother remembers going to a restaurant, and above the door there was a sign that said no dogs and no Indians, and she knew this meant them. As soon as they sat down, a waitress walked over and told them, "We don't serve your kind here." Rose asked to speak to the manager. The manager came and repeated what the waitress had said. Rose replied, "If you don't serve my family, I will inform the Chamber of Commerce why I won't consider your business for purchase." My family was served. To this day, my grandma Joyce recalls the discomfort of eating that meal as Indigenous people peered through the window at them in disbelief. 64 years later, after that meal at the restaurant, I was a part of the Fairbanks 4 movement, where 4 Indigenous men were arrested, convicted, and imprisoned through police and prosecutorial misconduct. The men were finally released and all charges were dropped after serving a combined 72 years in prison. We believed at that time that winning that case would change the system, but Indigenous men and women are still being falsely imprisoned at astronomical rates. Nothing has really changed. It is unbelievable that in 2020, we're still fighting for basic human rights. These 3 stories highlight the continuation of racial policies that although they've changed, they've also stayed the same. And individuals and social movements are very important in the fight for basic human rights and justice. However, without the laws that protect and ensure these basic human rights, injustice will continue. And the way to change the laws is to ensure that good people are elected into office. And to do this, I have 3 things that I think are critical in ensuring that that happens. 1, we need to normalize talking about politics, and it's come to a point where it's like Republican, Democrat, and people spit those words out like they're awful things, and instead of looking at the policies and realizing that there's a path to go to a better place, it's just like 2 different teams fighting each other constantly. And I think that part of that problem is because, or how that has come about is because it's improper or rude to talk about politics. So once all of us here can start doing this today, just start pushing for speaking about politics in a more kind way. I know that a lot of the time I have trouble with this because I've associated, I've done the same thing I'm talking about. I've associated opposition to human rights with Republicans. But yeah, so normalizing politics, and so that people right now, nobody knows who to vote for. They're just see these ads and they're slinging accusations at one another instead of showing exactly how we're going to move into the future in a good way. So if we take the responsibility of communicating these things together, then we'll probably reach more people, and through one-on-one contact, be able to uplift that much more better than social media or other forms of media. And so number 2, encourage and uplift good people to run for office. We haven't had as much choice as we need. 2-party politics is it's not enough anymore. And normalize outreach. Oh, I already kind of said this with number 1, but I put it as a bullet point for 3. Normalize outreach beyond social media and pushing for those to enter office. So it's really up to all of us. And like number 1 is just going out there and normalizing conversations and having those one-on-one conversations to help people understand that their vote is important. And yeah, I think that's about it. And next we'll have Leroy Williams, who's going to share the history of voting rights, the Voting Rights Act nationally, and his experience as a Black voter in Alaska since 1967.
I see Leroy coming off mute. There you are.
And first, I'd like to just say, hi, Evan. You don't look like what I thought you would look like, that's for sure. But anyway, my name is Leroy Williams, and I've been in Alaska for quite a few years, like since 1967, coming up here with the military, getting out, and then going to work with the municipality, and then becoming enlightened about the politics of Anchorage and Alaska. And that was basically through the pipeline and the disparate situation that faced people of color in trying to get jobs. They were bringing people in here from everywhere. So in that effort, I started getting involved with other people who were concerned and trying to find a way to address the situation appropriately. And we formed at that time a group called the Alaska Black Caucus. The current one is the Alaska Black Caucus number 2, and it has Celeste Hodges as the president. But we got started and made efforts to try to get economic opportunities, or make economic opportunities available for Blacks and people of color. There was voting going on, voting going on. And when I was asked by Evan to talk about the voting rights, basically my knowledge and information about it is what you hear nationally. I was born and reared in South Carolina and was there from the age of birth until the age of 10. But in that environment, started out really as a tenant farmer, which is not even equivalent to a sharecropper, with my mother finding a house with 7 kids and living there, and then migrating from there, literally, as a migrant farm worker along the East Coast until about the age of 15, when my mother decided education was better for her children than trying to make a living, and we stopped in New Jersey. And that's where I got my continued education or high school from age of about 15, got out at 17, looked around, no jobs in the farm, so I joined the military. There, got shipped to Alaska, which at that time would have been the only way I would have come to Alaska, because there were those boogie stories about living in Alaska. But migrated to Alaska, settled down here, got out after about 4 years, started working for the municipality, and worked at the municipality basically until I retired. During the time I was here and started to get involved with the community, there was always lots of talk by the Black people who had been here for a while about voting, about the need to get out and vote. And basically, as I started to get involved, awareness about getting involved into the community, there were people like Cal Williams, Mr. John Parks, Tammy Townsend, Ed Wood, et cetera, that constantly talked about the need for people to register and vote. In fact, that was an ongoing theme at the time, and it's still an ongoing theme, with there being volunteer efforts made for people to get to the polls. If they couldn't, they would be picked up and taken there. But that was always a part of my growth and development as far as politics are concerned. And I know this agenda item talks about the Voting Rights Act. Again, I know about that through what I have read here through local national media. And, you know, I was kind of isolated from what went on. Perhaps had I stayed in South Carolina, it would have been a bigger picture. But in Alaska, for whatever the reason, I suppose that's because there has been an active involvement in politics by at least the Black community here. Gerrymandering, those kinds of things has never been brought to my attention as a problem. And I did check before I came on here and asked some of the people I mentioned what they thought was the main problem, or those part of the problem, and they couldn't recall either. So I'm not trying to say that Alaska was different. And when I talked to Evan, I said, you know, perhaps out in the rural area where not as much of my attention was focused, there could have been those things going on, which would be something that perhaps an Alaska Native person could speak to better than me. But as far as the Black community is concerned in Anchorage, we did not have any noticeable, I even looked in the paper, instances of where there was a whole uproar about people being dissuaded from voting, their voting rights being usurped or whatever. So I then went to look at, again, what happened and what are some of the, maybe Alaska could be example, because I seem to notice that if people are constantly involved, if they are registered and they are voting, then it makes a big difference. And here, now, not only are we asking people to vote, we're following up on an register, we're following up and asking them, are you voting? Are you going to vote? And even get a little nose and say, you know, well, what party are you voting for? We can give you information and stuff like that, not trying to persuade one or the other. But, you know, those are some of the things that I've seen work here in Alaska. I think the current federal administration shows too why there should be a concerted effort now, maybe it should have been back then, for people of all colors to work together. Because what we're seeing now with this administration is an attack on everything you may have that makes you think of yourself as a proud American citizen. And believe you me, this administration doesn't seem to discriminate on whether you're Black or not Black. It'll go after if you happen to be probably maybe a suntan white person. They don't know the difference. So what it does show is that there is a need, and I think there's a growing act on that for people of color to work together to try to ensure their rights and try to ensure that their racial, economic, and social rights are gained and protected. Because if they don't, then they're going to find that they slip out of their hand. But what I would just like to say is that we really, really do need to be mindful of getting involved in the political system. To the fact that I looked at the redistricting, the appointments and stuff. I hadn't thought about that, but since I talked to Evan, I have gone and looked at how the redistricting process works here. And maybe we better go back a little further and determine what the mindset of those people who were appointed by the governor and some by the Supreme Court, what their mindsets are, if they are going to talk about redistricting and why. It's going to be based on a racial classification, people who don't do or don't vote for a particular party, etc. So it's given me really a wake-up call that there's still things that I need to do and we need to do to address the situation. So basically, that's my spiel, if you want to call it that. But that's my presentation and outlook. But I'm optimistic that that this country is changing, and this country this time is going to change and become more of what it's been announced to be or put in writing to be. And so I'm optimistic about that because I really had lost hope until recently. So I will just send it there.
Leroy, thanks so much. We'll pass it to Representative Chris Tompkins.
Yes, sir, I got that.
No, that was great, Leroy. Thank you.
Sorry.
No. Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan Christ Tompkins. I'm down in Sitka, and let me just go to gallery view here. So I'm in the House of Representatives. My district's all the sort of island communities down in Southeast Alaska. So from Prince of Wales in the south to Hoonah in the north, and many communities in between. And I hoping to provide some information and context on some of the policies and legislation as voting access goes. And I kind of made a sort of 4-point bulleted overview to cover. And just by way of context, the committees in the legislature that govern elections policy are called the State Affairs Committees. It's a wonderfully vague and encompassing name for a committee because arguably everything is the affairs of the state. But State Affairs is one of these very nondescript committee names, but includes jurisdiction of a bunch of things, including corrections, criminal justice, permanent funds, pensions, etc., but also the election system. And I love this committee. It's super sort of nerdy and nuts and bolts and wonky, and I've sat on it every year I've been in the legislature, and the last 4 years I've chaired or co-chaired the committee since the bipartisan coalition has been in power in the House of Representatives. All to say that I've developed a passion and an interest in elections policy through this committee, as well as have been involved or carried legislation and policy relating to elections. Background aside, I should enumerate the 4 points. In 2016, as many people probably remember, there was a ballot initiative that created and affected automatic voter registration in Alaska. And we can touch on that briefly. Then there's currently a vote by mail, also sometimes referred to as vote at home legislation that is active in the legislature right now. Also wanted to touch on, as the 3rd point, absentee ballot policy right now in these times of COVID and the decisions that Lieutenant Governor is making in terms of trying to not prevent, although that might be a Freudian slip, provide non-in-person means of voting to Alaskans to reduce risk of COVID-19 transmission. And then finally touch on redistricting, as Leroy flagged and sounds like, as you know, on the radar of others on this call. So starting with the first of those 4 points, automatic voter registration was something that Alaska Center was a huge driver behind, actually, our venerable conveners of this conversation. And this came about in 2016 when there are a group of Alaskans, and I was kind of in the mix back then, who had seen automatic voter registration go into effect in California and Oregon. I think it was just a handful of other states at that point in the United States. It was still pretty early adoption. And we're like, this is a great idea. We should do it in Alaska. And further, because we have the permanent fund dividend, we're like, well, we should make the trigger for getting automatically registered to vote the process of registering for your PFD. So if you register for your PFD, you also get registered to vote. And so we thought it was a great idea and wanted to help make it law in Alaska, and a sort of coalition formed around it that included Alaska Center, the Native community was a really critical and early supporter of the initiative. A lot of the Native corporations made contributions in the very early days to sort of launch the initiative. And it was a really freight train of an initiative. It passed by almost a 2-to-1 margin. And there was no organized opposition. And it's a really wonderful achievement in terms of, democratic access, small d democratic access in Alaska. And so I think that's just, just sort of a cornerstone in terms of elections policy that is good to remember and take stock of, and was a great collective accomplishment. But of course, much yet to be done. And it's worth noting, I should add, not to make things too peaches, roses, and unicorns, that there has been sort of a continued interest in eroding or reversing automatic voter registration since it passed in 2016. And that's come in the form of legislation or sort of other inquiries and means. And none of those attempts have really gone anywhere, but I think just sort of good for us all to be aware that, these really big steps forward just always have to be careful about backsliding and having that progress undone. So that was the first of the policy points I wanted to quickly touch on. The second of the 4 was vote by mail. And, vote by mail, the data is really compelling. More people vote when you have the option of voting by mail. Municipality of Anchorage is a great example, but even when you look at statewide vote by mail, it's pretty compelling. And notably in partisan terms, I know this isn't a partisan conversation, there's data that shows that actually vote by mail, just like everybody across the board, votes more. So there's not, a bias in turnout for one side of the political spectrum or the other. Whereas I think a lot of Republicans, notably our president, have put forward a public narrative that vote by mail is this, conspiracy that Democrats are going to start winning because it helps them. But at least a lot of emerging research suggests that it just more people vote, and so there's not a particular political benefit. So I'm a big sort of believer in vote by mail and its potential in Alaska, and introduced a bill in 2018, which I reintroduced last year in 2019. And so that legislation is active and hoping to hold some hearings actually this interim on that subject to sort of lay the foundation for next year. And I also know that there's interest about a ballot initiative for vote by mail. So, hopefully we'll make a really good push come 2021 legislature and see where we can get it. But just like automatic voter registration, there's always the option of pushing for positive systematic change by initiative, if other avenues fail. So just wanted to speak to vote by mail, and Kendra, thanks for that question in the chat. Why do people want to undo automatic voter registration? I don't know. I mean, I think there is perhaps among some a sense that automatic voter registration maybe has a negative political benefit to the right side of the political spectrum. Although again, the data doesn't bear that out. It's just sort of, it floats all boats. You could be far right, far left, middle of the road, whatever. Just everybody tends to vote more. There have been some really legitimate and substantive administrative issues in terms of implementing AVR and trying to find ways to run it more sort of economically. But it's kind of a baby bathwater situation. Like, yes, of course we want to do that, but at times it seems as though making some of these administrative efficiency improvements also becomes the sort of Trojan horse for getting rid of the whole thing or proposing to get rid of the whole thing. So that's just kind of my sense, but I wouldn't presume to speak for some of those folks. Senator Shower, for instance, I know has expressed interest in pushing back on automatic voter registration. Yeah, and Leroy, to your question, I think Senator Schauer, if I recall, introduced a bill that would effectively undo automatic voter registration. He's a Republican from the Matsu Valley, as many might know. And just to touch quickly on the last 2 points, right now we're in a really big elections policy and voter access issue with COVID-19 and the election later this month and in October for municipalities and November for the general. And the legislature passed a bill that gives the Division of Elections the option and prerogative to administer our elections by mail this year, both the primary and the general, to reduce transmission of COVID, and other states are doing this. The lieutenant governor didn't exercise that prerogative for the primary, as many might know, and sort of instead opted to send out absentee ballot applications to every Alaskan over 65. And, that's great. I'm glad all Alaskans over 65, my parents included, are going to get those applications. Of course, I am of the perspective, as are, I know, NPA and Alaska Center and many other organizations have been advocating universal absentee ballot application send out. And there's actually litigation right now to that effect. And I'm hoping that we will get universal access. And, there are, I think, sort of serious voter access issues. And like, look at Alaskans over 65, our elders, they're wonderful. But it's a very different generation in terms of diversity than say the younger generation, say voters under 30. And so, that's, I think, a consideration that's important when it comes to sort of equal access. And also, we just want to reduce COVID transmission across the board, no matter age. So I'm hoping that for the general election, the lieutenant governor will take a more aggressive approach for providing non-in-person voter access. So that's a really important issue. That's the third point I wanted to touch on. And then the last point to close out is on redistricting. And as many know, the redistricting board is taking shape right now. 4 of the 5 seats have been filled, 2 by the governor, 1 by Senate President Kathy Giesel, and 1 by Speaker of the House Bryce Edgman. And the last seat will be appointed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I believe that has to happen basically this month of August. And so that's something really to watch out for, because redistricting and gerrymandering really can overcome the most compelling candidates and the most driven, energetic campaigns when you draw the lines in kind of a way that just stacks the deck against someone. There was a bipartisan coalition in the Alaska Senate from 2016 to 2012, as many people might remember. And that coalition was terrific for Alaska. And that coalition came to a decisive end because in 2012, there were new lines drawn in the Alaska Senate, and a number of Democratic incumbents, they didn't even have a chance, really. The lines were drawn in a way that was so impossible for them to win. They lost re-election, and that includes Betty Davis, both of the Joe Thomas and Joe Paskvan, and in Anchorage, Albert Kukesh in Southeast Alaska. So it was just electoral decimation, and that's the power of redistricting and gerrymandering. So we have another redistricting cycle coming up, and I think important for all Alaskans to pay really close attention and remember that we also have legal recourse if the lines are drawn in too gerrymandered a way. And I can relate. I was first elected in a district that was gerrymandered in 2012. And the Supreme Court ordered that the lines be redrawn after I was elected. So in 2014, I ran in a district with modified lines as dictated by that Supreme Court decision. So hopefully we won't have gerrymandered lines in the first place, but if that does happen, hopefully we can join forces to make sure that a fair map is drawn. And and in Alaska, I think it's more a concern of, I think, sort of conservative voices gerrymandering the map against progressive voices, just given the balance of power in the state. And I think it's always worth mentioning that Democrats do this too. They do it in states that they control. Maryland is a great example. So it's sadly a blade that cuts both ways. And I think it would be best for the Republic if just gerrymandering stopped across the board, and D's didn't do it to R's and R's didn't do it to D's. We just had fair districts and fair elections. So that's the ideal. Hopefully we'll all get to at some point. And I'll just jump into a couple of these questions. I hope that's okay. But for Chantal, vote by mail and vote at home, those two are synonymous. There are some organizations and I think some parts of the country that refer to vote by mail as vote at home. So those two, tomato, tomato, exactly the same. And then absentee voting is kind of a different process, although it usually refers to when you have in-person voting, but you have the option of basically voting by mail, voting by absentee. And Jean, yeah, the census is hugely important in terms of it determines, if certain communities or populations are undercounted, then their representation is diluted. And that's why the census is so important, and also very concerned that the Trump administration is truncating the census enumeration process by a month, which may result in undercounting certain communities. It's really unfortunate news. So I hope that's helpful, and I'll pass it back to Kendra to carry it forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. A couple things, and I might have a follow-up question for you. And of course, if anyone else has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box still. But definitely for the census, that's something that NPA has been working on. I know others, ACPERG, I'm sure Barry can speak to this, and others, we've been trying to write letters to our congressional delegation and doing whatever we can to go back to that October date, because that's what we were really basing our census on. The outreach that we've been doing in the pandemic, you can't go door to door, and our indigenous communities are just hugely, hugely impacted right now. And just want to mention too, that this relates a lot to funding that's going to be coming back to our districts. So we could lose a lot of funding if we don't get a good census count. We can have more issues with redistricting. It's super, super important that everyone goes and fills out the census. So that's something else I want to say. It's super quick. I did it. Just takes a couple minutes online. So if you have not done that, encourage you all to do that, because it's just hugely important. Something else, we talk a lot about like voting access, and this is something I've worked in numerous different jobs about voting access. Everything I worked with Get Out the Native Vote for a little while, and of course I'm with Native People's Action Community Fund. We do a lot of work around voting, and I also have a background in policy. And as JKT knows, I worked a lot on voting reforms, and so this is just something that's been hugely important to me. The House actually passed legislation a couple different times to just increase access to voting and try to get rid of some of those barriers that currently exist in state statute. Unfortunately, it's just never made it past the finish line. So I really hope that this legislation can be reviewed again. And I appreciate these conversations about vote at home, vote by mail, because this is a wave of things that we need to be looking into. And, also making sure that we're addressing what is the hybrid. For Alaska, a hybrid system is really what we're going to need, is to make sure that we have early voting options if we're able to go in person, but also still being able to send in our ballot. We're lucky in Alaska that we don't need a reason to get an absentee ballot. There are some states that need a reason, we do not. But I still think that we still have barriers. For example, just as Jonathan mentioned, only 65 enrollers get an application, and that's just getting an application. You got to fill it out, send it in. And, when we think about in a time of COVID, I think of my grandmother. She's 91 years old. I mean, she's sending out the application. She's got to fill it out, stamp it, send it back. You have a whole nother issue with witness signatures too. So we think about times of COVID, there's a number of different things we need to think about we also need to address what's happening with the Postal Service. And I just saw that actually come up, so right on time with the Postal Service on what's that funding going to look like. And again, that's really talking with our federal delegation. Postal Service is super, super important, you know, in the country, and especially in Alaska, where we already have a kind of a slow system. And so if you live out in rural Alaska, there are some options that you can do to get your ballot earlier. There's a 45-day option. So there's, when you're filling out your absentee ballot application online or on paper, it will ask you that. So that's something to really be thinking about. And just a couple things. I also do want to mention, some people have mentioned to me before, like, oh, my vote may not matter, and how does that work? Well, I have a long list, I'm happy to provide it, maybe I'll throw it on our website, of elections in Alaska that have been won very, very narrowly. And, you know, Bryce Edgman is an example that we can talk about when he ran against Carl Moses, I believe in 2006, and it was tied. And it was won by a coin toss because it was tied. We have House District 1. We have just this last election cycle was won by 1 vote. So I feel like those are just 2 examples right there that we can say that, you know, your voice really does matter. You really can make an impact on your elections here. And, you know, it's just exercising your right to vote. We are electing individuals to speak for us, to make policy changes. So when we're thinking about our values, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, this is how you should vote. I'm just saying you need to get out and vote. Looking at the research, the individuals that are voting your values, and understanding we're sending people down to Juneau or to DC to be making those decisions for us. And it impacts our everyday life. It impacts our traditional way of life as Indigenous people when you think about the hunting and fishing regulations that are being done. So really everything down to, you know, roads, our ferry system. We think these are individuals that are really making those decisions. And Jonathan, you're also welcome to jump in. I know it was an interesting time there. I spent, you know, 10 years in the Alaska legislature as a staff member. So really got, you know, very involved in a lot of the policies. And so just wanted to encourage everyone, say that little bit of story, and also talk about voting access, and encourage to make sure that we have voting in all of our communities. And I want to push that for Jonathan. One last story, and then I'm going to get to look at the questions. A few years back, there was an individual that contacted me and said he really wanted to vote, and he was at the Alaska Native Medical Center. I went and picked up his wife, drove her to individual elections, got the ballot, drove her back. He was able to vote. She signed it. I drove her back, and she dropped off the ballot. Then I drove her back to the Alaska Native Medical. It took about 2 hours for this one individual to get their vote. You know, and that shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have to take so long to do that. So one of the things that we advocated for at Native People's Action was to get an early voting location at Alaska Native Medical Center, since that is somewhere where a lot of people may end up and not have a way to vote. And the director did contact me, Gail Fanumia, and said that they're going to start that this year in 2020. So we were really excited about that. But thinking about where we can do more changes like that, how else can we make sure that voting is accessible to everyone across the state? So I'm looking forward to your hearings, Jonathan, and you know I'll be tuning in and sending you emails. And I encourage everybody else to be doing the same and talking about the experiences that you have with voting, because a lot of times we may not know, or legislators may not know, of barriers that are happening in your communities. So if you call him up, call Jonathan. I know he's easy to talk to, and he can work with you, and your own legislator, of course. Call them too. If you don't know who they are, you can go on the website and find out. But really, they're personable, they listen, and Jonathan's always been very responsive when I said, hey, what about this? What about this option? And how can we work on these bills together? But we need to know from people across Alaska what's really going on so those issues can be addressed. Okay, that was awfully long, but I get
And
very passionate about voting.
can I chime in with just a couple of points?
Yes, please.
I mean, first of all, Kendra was like the all-star testifier in state affairs when she was still working for the legislature and carried a couple of really comprehensive and important election reform bills. So she is like the expert in our midst here and really moved the ball down the field a long ways. So Kendra, there's always a chair in the committee available for you in the future if you get a hankering to circle back. Yeah, and I mean, just sort of blanket, you know, if I or my office can ever be helpful on election stuff, if you have ideas or questions, just drop an email, and we always try to be sort of responsive and get substantive info back in turn. I'll drop my email in the chat. So yeah, if we can ever be of service, let us know.
So I'm gonna go through here. We've got a few questions for any of our
Kendra, I may jump in really quickly and speak to barriers as well. I really appreciated Leroy's point about when you talk to people, when you ask questions, when you're you know, talking to folks about voting and you're asking about what are the physical barriers, what's keeping you from voting this year. A lot of us, I think, expect that conversation to lead to hard barriers, things like transportation, things like time, things like, of course, this year with COVID safety, ability to access that application, which is only going out to certain people. In some long-term listening that we've done and some research that we've been able to do over the years, one of the things that we found out about some less likely voters, less frequent voters, is that those barriers do exist, those real concrete barriers, but then the majority of people are facing more psychological barriers and things that are a little bit less easy to measure. And so we found that out of people who said that they weren't going to vote in one election, I think this was in 2018, like a third of people said, so the hard barriers, like things like not enough time, a third of people said essentially that they didn't believe that their voice would matter. And a third of people said that they believed that, yeah, the difference between like their voice doesn't matter and then just a general lack of confidence in the system or belief that the system is, decisions are being made without them. And yet we live in the state of Alaska where elections are won by incredibly small margins, and the majority of our state, the control of our legislature was essentially in the balance of one vote in one legislative district in the interior, right? And so we know that our voices make a difference. And I think before we go fully into Q&A, I think we wanted to show a video from Begina Kara, who's a business owner, and I know Ryan has that queued up. So keep those questions ready, and if you want to get typing or type them in the chat, put them there, and we will get to them. But yeah, just quickly before we play that video, I think a lot of those barriers for people can be things like language access, yeah, things like that lack of confidence that I mentioned, and just an inability to access one of many hurdles, whether it's registration or the absentee ballot system or the need to go to one place on one specific day. And I'm really excited about the networks that we have in place in state to help overcome some of those barriers. And I'm also really thrilled to be on the phone with Rep. Christ Tompkins and so many of you who are working on these real changes to make our elections more accessible. And Jonathan mentioned many of them, and a few others that we didn't get to are things like the 16-year-old pre-registration legislation was introduced by Rep. Hopkins, and same-day registration, which has been introduced several times by Rep. Tuck now and others. So yeah, there's a number of changes out there, and of course lots and lots of legislation at the national level as well to help tackle some of these. But I will kick it over to Ryan, and we'll hear from Begina Kara.
Hello, my name is Begina Kira, also known as Baina Candy. I'm the owner of Diamond VIP Services and Bikui. I just wanted to say that I am grateful for the privilege of voting. I recognized after this year's catastrophe happening throughout the world that I have been irresponsible with my voting privilege, and I am taking a stand to change that. I realize that my misinformed and uneducated self needs a revamp, and I am taking the steps so that I can properly vote, vet my candidates, understand the terminology with the ballots, and I am working to create a platform so that people like me won't tic-tac-toe their vote. They won't name recognition their vote. And I just want to thank you for this opportunity to share.
Okay, and I think we are moving into that Q&A phase. I see a bunch of questions in the chat, and I think all our speakers are still on to help us answer questions.
Evan, do you want to read a couple or do you want me to take it away? I'm just scrolling through here. Here's a question from Nicholas. Do you have any suggestions for effective voter engagement, either through phone banking for candidates or supporting specific campaigns for the Senate House presidency? JKT or Evan? Did we lose JKT?
I won't speak from a partisan frame, but I would say in terms of, I think part of this question is getting at effective voter engagement. And of course, that looks really different this year than it does in other years. And while there are, I believe, a few candidates and maybe groups as well knocking doors and going door to door in Alaska, I certainly don't recommend that to anyone, and for a lot of reasons, mainly because the person at the door can't consent necessarily to you being there and having that conversation with you. But I think phone banks are super effective. So you could work with a group or the candidate themselves to support something like that. And I think some groups are set up to do text banks as well. And I think the tried and true method that I would recommend to everyone are lit drops in your neighborhood, packets of information to your neighbor.
And I also want to add, like, family members and friends, that, you know, that's a super effective way too for, it's just encouraging. I always reach out to my friends and family to make sure that they voted. And so that's something easy that I feel like we can all do. And, you know, it's easy as well. Question here from Mackenzie. Does anyone know the regs for Alaska? Is the date postmarked for the national election or the date received? And I believe it's you have to have your ballot postmarked by election day.
That's right. One asterisk there is that the date for requesting your absentee ballot, the deadline for that, for your application form to be received, is by 10 days prior to the election. So for our upcoming primary election, that deadline is coming up. We'll share a little bit more soon about exactly how to do that and walk you through the process to do it online. If you're doing it online, no problem, deadline Saturday. If you're doing it, of course, by mail, you know, you'd have to get that in the mail, you know, by Thursday or drop it off in an office, you know, Friday or Saturday.
One of the comments, we need more and younger poll workers. And something I just wanted to mention is that's one thing we've been having, I know that divisions have complications with, is getting poll workers. You know, during COVID, and it sounds like that they're still working on that, but that's an issue that we really have to think about. And I'd be interested to maybe hear, maybe some talk about this in state affairs, Jonathan, when we're talking about those bills, is what are we going to be doing for that? I mean, that's something thinking about, you know, pandemic time, what's going to happen if we have polling locations that close, especially in like small communities where there may not be another option. How's that going to be addressed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've heard some anecdotal feedback that especially rural parts of the state, it's just crickets in terms of poll worker recruitment and retention. And it's something that I've had private conversations with some colleagues about, potentially trying to learn more about the sort of state of preparation for the primary and general elections. But I think there's a bit of concern or uncertainty around it. And I mean, not to sort of make this circular to vote by mail, but I mean, I think is in my mind, sort of a proof point that it's like, oh, well, maybe we should look at a by mail election for the general. So we just avoid the risks and recruitment challenges of poll workers, given that, you know, people are kind of voting with their feet, poll workers that is, and not wanting to potentially expose themselves.
A comment here from Jean. Please mention to get postmarked on envelope at the post office. If you put into the mailbox, it may get sent somewhere and not get postmarked till the next day or later. So that is an important point, to make sure that you're getting it postmarked if you're mailing it on, you know, election day, so your ballot can be counted. So thank you for that comment. And I just want to make sure and read that one aloud. There's some good links that are being dropped in here. I see Vary's putting in some things on different deadlines. You can go to the Division of Elections websites to look at the deadlines for making sure to get an absentee ballot requested. Early voting has started, so those are things that you can start doing as early vote if you want to go in person. You know, one of the changes that we had talked about was also having absentee voting to be that you could, rather than filling out an application every single year. This is something I know the House passed last year, or this year. And so you don't have to keep filling out an application over and over again. It's just doing it once. And so that was like trying to want to be one of the small steps. We can't currently do that, but you know, those are other options that we look at for changes.
There was a question from, I think it's Sochil in the chat about the cost of stamps and kind of quote modern poll tax. What I might say about that quickly is that I think what our response frequently has been to that question is encourage everyone who is able to return their ballot physically in person, and not necessarily worry about the stamp in the mail system. So of course, in our local elections in Anchorage, we're all used to using those drop boxes, right? But at the state elections, we won't necessarily have drop boxes around the state, but every single in-person polling place is a place where you can return your ballot, no matter what precinct you're coming from. And so that means every single polling place on election day, but it also means all of the early voting sites that are open for 2 weeks prior. It looks like Shauna Toma maybe had your hand raised.
Hi, Evan.
Hey.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. This is Shauna Toma. I'm a volunteer with the League of Women Voters. And I wanted to say that one of the big things in Anchorage that has successfully run vote by mail for a couple of years is just the turnout. There's a turnout change because people, you know, I think several reasons, but one of the big ones is people had a lot more time to be able to vote, 21 days, depending on when you got your ballot. So more than 2 weeks, that's a nice long time. And also people have the internet and their families. They can talk to their families. They can consult with their friends. People call me to ask who to vote for, and I'm happy to tell them. People can figure out the ballot measures. Municipal elections always have kind of complicated, a big list of ballot measures. We had 13, I think, this year. And the turnout was good. Even in the pandemic, we still went up to 30%, which was high for a municipal election. But just a tiny bit of voting in history, between 2017, before vote by mail started, 23% of our voters voted. That was a little over 49,000 people. When we started vote by mail 1 year later, 36% of our voters voted, 79,000 people. There was a big difference. And that told us, and we looked at the neighborhoods where people voted, and the more working class neighborhoods, the more demographically challenged, financially challenged people voted more. They were able to vote because they had time to do it. They were able to do it at home. A lot of people work 1, 2, 3 jobs. People have kids. It's just normal stuff. It's not that people don't want to vote. I mean, there are lots of barriers to that. People are freaked out about lots of things all the time. But on the other hand, just by giving people more time and the ability to look into issues, they voted. We could also tell this year, I was really looking at how many people voted on complex ballot measures, and people will skip them if they're too hard, and they didn't skip them. People filled those in. And so there was no big drop off when it came to complicated things because people could look them up. So having time to do it helps. Having flexibility helps. Having time to look things up helps. And also the other interesting thing is that people did use the drop boxes, but they also did go to the post office. They did mail them. Even during the pandemic, people, I think, magically got stamps, because I think even getting a stamp this day and age is hard unless you remember to get it one at Costco or something. I agree with the stamp challenge, and I do wish the municipality and the state provided postage, and we're working on that. But it's a really big deal. The numbers have been much higher than in the past for voting. In 2010, I looked back a few years, and it was 39,000 people voted in a municipal election. 39,000 to vote by mail, 79,000. So I think that while it's a global way to help people have access to a ballot and to voting.
Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate the comments. And, something else that's been talked about, and then we hand it over to Evan to do a quick resource information to get some more information. But online, there's been mentioned, like, you have to have a driver's license or state ID, and I know that can be complicated for some areas in rural Alaska. You can call the Division of Elections, ask them to send you an application. If you have decent enough internet connection, you can also download an application online and mail it in. You can also reach out to some of our organizations, and maybe you can screen share the presentation and outreach to us. Native Peoples Action Community Fund. Our websites are going to pop up, the Alaska Center. There's lots of folks I know that will help, and this is what we're here for. I'm happy to help get people information. We're going to be putting up toolkits on our websites, trying to get out information on, just who's on the ballot, where to find your polling locations. So these are some really great resources. And Evan, I'll let you kind of take it more from here as well, and showing us the online option too.
Absolutely, sounds good. So I see a question from Sue, and I might answer it quickly, and I think it'll kind of get answered within these next several slides as well. So we're going to walk through really quickly how we can, and if you want to pull your phone out or open another window or another tab, if you haven't yet applied for your absentee ballot, either for the primary election or for both elections, want to encourage you to do so, and we can take 5 minutes and do that together now. We've just got about 10-12 minutes left together, and we'll conclude with some upcoming events in the community hosted by League of Women Voters and Alaska Black Caucus, and others. So that's what's kind of coming up after this little preview. But to answer Sue's question, paper applications, you do not need necessarily a driver's license or a state ID. It does ask you to provide an identifier. But that identifier can be the last 4 of your social as well, and I think your birth date is required on there either way. The one thing that's fun and good about the paper applications in terms of access is that you can print them, sign them with wet ink, take a photo with your phone, or scan them and return them via email. That is okay as well. So there's a couple different ways there that you can get those in if you don't have a state ID and the ability to apply online. Kate, yeah, see your question as well. Anyone over 65 should be getting that ballot request form in the mail. It's not an absentee ballot. You'll still have to take that form and mail it back. So if we can move to the next, really quickly before we jump, there's 2 other links on here. Just these are national groups that I highly recommend if you're interested in kind of digging into the specific policies within voting rights that we don't necessarily have a lot of the bad ones yet here in Alaska, right? And we're going to keep fighting against them. But some of the threats that we're seeing in the lower 48 in particular are really well laid out by the Brennan Center. And the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights is where I got that information about the closed polling places across the state. So both of those are worth looking into, and then we'll walk through this system so that we can see all really quickly how quick and easy it is. Truly, I did it in 5 minutes on my phone, and I had my ballot within a week when I applied a few weeks ago. So I'd love to hear if anyone is able to do this live. Drop it in the chat when you're done, and maybe we can get a couple of new absentee ballots sent to folks' homes through this. But you can quickly see some of the instructions here on the front page. If you end up at this link, it's absenteeballotapplication.alaska.gov. If you end up here and you don't have a state ID, you can still click that link and apply using the paper form. Again, as Kendra mentioned, you can also call the Division of Elections and ask them to mail you a paper form if you need. We can go to the next slide. So there's, this is just a quick, you're just giving them consent to use an electronic copy of your driver's license or state ID to verify your identity. You don't need a copy. You don't need to take a photo or a copy or anything like that. You just need the number. So you'll have to click that, and we can move to the next slide. There's 3 quick questions, and I may have missed one in here, but there's a slide that asks really quickly if you're 18 years old, if you're a citizen of the United States. Those are the 2 most important questions in this form. If you can't say a yes to those questions, they won't let you advance. I believe the one that asks about 18 years old probably also has an exception because you can get registered within 90 days of your 18th birthday. So I think there's an asterisk there. But when we get to this page, it'll ask just for your core information, and somebody had asked, do you need, so this is a little bit different than on the paper form. On the paper form, if you give a driver's license or a state ID number, that's the only identifier you do need to give. I'm looking at this now, and it looks like the last 4 of your social is required as well. So just keep in mind, both of those pieces of information have got to go in there, and date of birth as well. And we can go to the next slide. What's great about these forms is this is also essentially your voter registration update. So if you have moved, that will get reflected up in here as well. So mark off your residence address and your mailing address. It's really, just to be clear, the distinction between these 2, your residence address is where you go to sleep at night. Your mailing address is where you receive mail. In Alaska, I know that those two addresses are sometimes, but by no means often, the same. And so just want to make sure that they can, get this ballot to the right place. I think there's another option on the next slide about, so this asks for your permanent mailing address. And there's a later slide that asks where you want your ballot mailed to, if you're out of state or if you're living with family somewhere else, or for some reason not at that address. Here on this next slide, you have your drop down of your political affiliation. You can select nonpartisan or undeclared. You can also declare a party. Your political affiliation does not necessarily, but can determine the ballot that you receive in the primary election. So you do still have a couple days if you fill this out and you haven't already to receive your ballot for the primary election. They ask, so I won't get all the way into it, but we have an open primary for the Democratic and Alaska Independence Party primary and Libertarians, etc. So if you're nonpartisan or you're undeclared or you're a Democrat or you're one of those parties, then you can check that box and receive that ballot in the mail. If you are one of those other parties, you cannot check the Republican Party's ballot because they have a closed primary. So Republicans, registered Republicans, as well as nonpartisans and undeclareds can all elect to vote in the Republican party primary as well. Of course, you can only pick one lane. Of course, in person, this is all like a little bit more clear. On the document, it's just really important to make sure you make the choice that you want for this time. It does not necessarily, if you check the drop-down box, that'll change your party to that party. Choosing a ballot for the primary does not necessarily change your party. Let me know if there's questions on that. We can go to the next slide. I think this is it on the. Yeah, so this was one of the first slides, sorry, that got out of order here. The yes, I'm a citizen of the United States, and yes, I'm 18 years old. There's one question on here. If you select all in calendar year, it will just automatically select those others. It's a little bit strange to do this because the REAA elections only happen in specific parts of rural Alaska where they don't necessarily have boroughs or like local school boards. And so it automatically checks that box for you, even though I bet that maybe 80 or 90% of the people on this call will not be voting in that election. Don't worry about it. It's, they will not mail you an election, mail you a ballot for an election that you're not eligible in. It's okay, just check all in calendar year, or you can specifically check August and November. Either one's gonna work. Let me know if there's questions. I know I just threw out a ton of information, but the last thing I was going to mention from the slide before this was it does ask for contact information. You don't necessarily need to give 2 phone numbers, but giving your phone number and your email address is just their way to stay in touch with you about your ballot. If there's any issues getting it to you, they don't necessarily ask that on a voter registration form, or you don't necessarily need to fill it in a voter registration form. But here on the absentee ballot application form, it is good to write it in there, and I think it is required. Oh yeah, this last slide is just it's just a readout of all of your information. So this is just your final confirmation page. So I think that was 8 slides total, 8 steps total. But of course, it doesn't necessarily ask for all that much information on each slide. This is your final opportunity to review. I've blacked out my information, but yours will be listed here. And there's that final statement that you're meant to read and affirm and sign at the end, but pretty pain-free process as far as these things go. Yeah, and I'm gonna kick it over to Barry DeSubro here in a second to help close us out and to give us a primer for the next webinar in this series, the third in this policy webinar series. But quickly, I wanted to mention a couple of upcoming opportunities where some similar topics and engagement opportunities are coming up. Virtual Wild Salmon Day is this coming Monday, the 10th. There's a link there and we can send these slides around. We'll have more information soon about a Women's Equality Day. Awesome. We've got our first online application in. Keep dropping in the chat if anyone else does. We have a Women's Equality virtual celebration on the 26th of August to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, hosted by a number of groups, including League of Women Voters and the Women's Empowerment Network. And finally, on the 28th, that same week, we'll be celebrating the 57th anniversary of the historic March on Washington. And I believe that this march is hosted by the Alaska Black Caucus and the NAACP of Anchorage, and also in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter marches of this summer as well. So from there, I'll pass it to Veri, and we have links and more information on the slides for each of those as well.
Thank you so much, Evan. Hi, everyone. Briefly, I know that we don't have a lot of time, but my name is Veri. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the executive director of ACPERG and living on Dena'ina lands. I want to thank Mr. Leroy Williams, Misty To'Ojri, Nikolai, and Representative Chris Tompkins for sharing powerful stories and advice, as well as a landscape for going forward. And speaking of going forward, I also wanted to share that we have our next webinar coming up in this policy sort of catalyzing change series will be on Tuesday, September 8th between 1 to 2:30 p.m. So that will be talking about the history of non-discrimination in Alaska, and of course the flip side to that as discrimination, but with the understanding that learning our histories helps inform how we go forward. So I hope that you'll join us then, and if you look out on Facebook or sign up on any of our listservs, we'll be emailing out about it as well. Thank you so much all for your time, for Evan and Kendra for guiding us, and for Kelsey for grounding us. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and week. And every person 65 years and older will receive an absentee ballot no matter what. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks for joining us.